Okay, this is Crossfire. Let's see. So Crossfire is a period of questioning between you and your opponent, and the purpose of which is to try to get your opponent to slip up and to try to work their arguments against them and to clarify certain matters. So the first thing you should do in first cross is to agree on reality. So this is where you agree on your definitions and your framework or disagree on them. If you have different definitions and framework, you should not agree to your opponents because your case should ideally be built around your definitions and framework. If you want, you can compromise, although I wouldn't personally recommend it, but under no circumstances should you concede. You should, however, try to get your opponent to concede theirs. So just at the beginning of the round, you either agree or disagree on the frameworks and definitions, so that way you can bring it up later in your other speeches. And the other main purpose of first cross is to ask clarification questions, but you shouldn't only ask clarification questions because then it might seem like you didn't pay attention. So this is where you ask questions like, I'm sorry, I missed your first contention. What was it? Or if you don't understand what your opponent's point said, this is where you can ask questions about that too. Another thing to do is to set up your own arguments, and you also should poke holes in your opponent's arguments. You can also do pathos moments, like tension-reducing questions. Like if your opponent gets really worked up, then you can just ask a simple question like, do you affirm or negate the resolution? Or what color is the sky? Or something. And this one is more kind of a technique, but could also be seen as a purpose, trying to get your opponent to take a stance. And this is basically where you set up a question that if they answer it, they would be proclaiming a stance. So if you believe that the US is a democracy, then what color is the sky? And obviously you would use a more relevant question than what color is the sky. But if they answer that question without correcting that, then they are agreeing that they believe that the US is a democracy. And I know that's unrelated to this resolution, but it's pretty useful. Another purpose for Crossfire is to demonstrate in-round abuse, and this is observation and definition debate questions, and I will explain that in another video. And another one is extra prep time. So this is so important because this is where you can start flowing your next speech and thinking about what you're going to say, how you're going to respond to your opponent's points, but you can't be so obviously doing that in round. You have to actually engage with your opponent. Another kind of devious purpose to Crossfire is your credibility and make assertions. So this is where you kind of bring down your opponent's credibility and elevate your own. So this is where you could ask things such like, did you have a source or evidence for your first contention? And then if you have sources and evidence for your first contention and they don't, it'll look really good for you. Another is reductio ad absurdum. This is kind of a technique more than a purpose, but this is where you take an argument to the absolute extreme. So if the argument was that, well, math and science do coincide, they are different. So you would say something like, oh, so you think that math and science are very different. Like, they're not the same. They do not interact. And if they do agree, then you can use that in your next speeches. Remember, in Crossfire, if you do get them to make a concession, if you do get them to do something that you want, do not start railing on them. Save all of that for your next speech. And another purpose of Crossfire is to get them to concede, your opponents to concede. So this would be framework or definitions, or even their points, but it's pretty hard. And another one is drive-by attacks, and it's really hard to do this one, but if you can do it well, it works out amazingly. But you really have to know what you're doing going into it. So it's basically you ask a question, if this is true, then wouldn't that mean this? And then if that is true, wouldn't it mean this? And you keep doing that until A equals E. So A equals B, B equals C, C equals D, D equals E, then that means A equals E. And so you're kind of trying to trap them there. So you're leading up a chain into something that they normally want to agree on, unless you had done this drive-by. So how to prepare for crossfire. And again, you should not use prep time for it. It is not a very important part of the round. But to prepare, you should gather intel. So maybe make sure that you know exactly what's in your case. Maybe even pull up your blocks if you need to. And break the arguments into pieces. So if you're trying to apply techniques and ask them questions that like poke holes and try to reduce their credibility, break their arguments into pieces, and it'll be a lot easier to do. So often effective techniques. And the hidden premise is actually very similar to take a stance, but it is slightly different because it's less about what your opponent believes and it's more about the actual case. So an example of that would be, this is just a different resolution. When legalization increases human trafficking, what legal frameworks would be set up to prevent it? So if they answer that without contesting legalization increasing human trafficking, then they would be agreeing that legalization would increase human trafficking, and you can use that in your next speeches. Another thing you can do is selective rereading of their cards. So their cards would be their evidence and their points and their warrants and their impact. So that would just, you wouldn't read all of it, you would just read parts of it and kind of misconstrue what they mean. Another one is reverse pit of doom. This is where you complement their argument to get them to explain, and you find a contradiction, and you tie it into your case, in your rebuttal and your defense. You don't do that in crossfire. Again, save it for your speech. You can also explore their motives, so what they think is driving their points. You can offsets and self-correction, so that would be if you have 2 points that are essentially the same thing, then you can make that point moot. You can make it not apply to the round because it is essentially the same thing. You can also appeal to ignorance, so that would be with your lay judges, and a lay judge is a judge who doesn't know much about debate, if anything. So you can use less points that don't make as much sense to people who really know the resolution. Another one is be nice. Just be nice to your opponent. Be very calm, be collected, and listen to your opponent. Don't seem so distracted, and don't be constantly writing stuff down on your flow pad. It is important to use it for prep time, but don't just be doing that. When you are being questioned, listen, again, appear helpful. You can filibuster a little bit, but don't filibuster all the time. Ask clarifying questions, not with an obvious question. Know your stance. That way you don't get tripped up in take a stance questions and reductio ad absurdum questions and hidden premise questions. You can say, I don't know, but don't say that all the time. Also in clarification questions, if your opponent is trying to clarify something you still don't understand, it is perfectly valid to say, explain it to me like I am 5, because that'll highlight that they aren't actually explaining it that well, and maybe they're using prep time to try to further their own arguments. Or prep time, sorry, crossfire to further their own arguments instead of actually answering the question. Let's see. Things to avoid is don't be a jerk, don't look evasive. Actually, when your opponent is being evasive, you can, like if they're answering a question but going all the way around, and not actually answering, like, yes, but, you could say, this is a yes or no question, and then repeat your question, and they will have to say either yes or no. And after that, you thank them, of course. Don't add stereotypes, so don't obviously don't be racist or sexist or anything. That's just something to avoid in general. Avoid softball questions, which is just, like, questions that aren't super relevant to the round and will not help you in any way. Don't let them make answers that hurt you. So this would be kind of like an invasive question. If they're like, yes, but this is the case, that's where you can cut them off and say, this is a yes or no question. If they are continuing to talk after you think they've clarified them, you can actually, like, politely cut them off and just say, thank you. Don't give them time to persuade the judge instead of actually answering the question. Because if you're giving them time, that's basically giving them a rebuttal. Don't beat a topic to death. And don't act distracted, but don't beat a topic to death, which is basically don't continue arguing over topic that you will get no further with by continuing to argue. Use the rest of your cross time for other questions. Don't talk over your opponent, and don't ask vague questions. Okay, that's cross.